Hollywood.
The Hollywood Foreign Press.
In Hollywood, it's the 50s. Issue in Hollywood.
What do you think of when I say Hollywood? Most likely, it's one of two things. The first and most obvious is the golden age, enjoyed by American cinema from the 20s till the widespread use of television in the late 50s, early 60s. And of course you do. This was the time when Hollywood was king, baby. But there's another possibility. Another time that defined this area in California. This time was the new Hollywood movement, beginning in the late 60s with the end of the Hays Code and after a shift in production to more ambitious and independent features like The Graduate. This era of pure creativity and lax studio control produced some of the finest films of all time. The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, Taxi Driver, 2001, Network, Eraserhead, even bigger films like Jaws and Star Wars. Remember these, we're going to come back. The cinema of the 70s was the cinema of New Hollywood. And look at how many of the greatest directors were directly birthed as a consequence of this era or flourished more than ever in it. Martin Scorsese, Stanley Kubrick, David Lynch, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, John Cassavetes, and countless others. So if this was both a critical and mostly commercially thriving era, why did it end? Why aren't we still in the time of New Hollywood? In truth, that's a complex question, one we're going to answer in this video, or at least attempt to. But when it comes to pinning down historical scapegoats, pointing fingers at one monumental failure that destroyed this Eden of cinema, it has to be Michael Cimino's third directorial effort, 1980's Heaven's Gate. So let's see what this great boogeyman of Hollywood's history is, and how the masterpiece of this mad director essentially ruined his career. And in the process, all of Hollywood. Or so you've been told. It would be absurd to pin the downfall of Hollywood solely on this looming shadow of a film. So let's first address the elephant in the room and understand what brought about and eventually brought an end to this prosperous era. If you don't care about all the history and everything, skip to this time code where we get into the analysis of the film proper. The New Hollywood movement began for many reasons, but essentially can be understood as the combination of three major factors. The first and most important of these was the ending of the Hays Code. The motion picture production code, nicknamed the Hays Code after the president of the MPAA, founder William Hays, was a set of strict guidelines which defined what could and couldn't be done in a Hollywood film. It was essentially an early version of the MPAA rating system, but instead of getting an R rating for saying the F word, your movie just didn't get made or distributed. And because it was shot on celluloid, it probably just got burnt too. Now, this is an exaggeration and a joke, by the way. Now, there are a lot of reasons why the Hays Code existed in the first place. It ran from 1934 to 1968, and those dates alone should tell you something. Starting in the middle of the Depression, an era when movie theaters were bigger than ever and largely the sole contributing factor in forming the power of the Hollywood studio system, the code was, in a lot of ways, a means to appeal to a wider audience. Money talks, and money was scared that violent, sexual, experimental, or non-narrative films would threaten its position, so something had to be done. There were, of course, many other factors, including a host of prominent film scandals over the years before, but perhaps the biggest reason, aside from the advent of talkies, was a growing moral concern in the political world. This was a time directly after the Roaring Twenties and quickly approaching World War II, a deeply conservative time in a bunch of different regards. Many politicians were afraid of moral corruption in America, and chief among these was William Hayes. He thought films didn't deserve free speech and should instead be elements of propaganda meant to teach the American public how to be better citizens, hence the code. They were tools for education, not art or entertainment. If you get the chance, look into the specifics of the code. They're rather interesting, especially the early do's and don'ts variation of it. For instance, white slavery depicted on screen was always under the no category, but rape or sexual assault was only listed as be careful. As is often the case of art facing oppression or adversity, many screenwriters and directors found clever ways to get around the code, mostly through very obvious metaphors, with one of the best and most well-known coming at the end of 1959's North by Northwest. And this creative thinking would certainly be cited for the string of absolute classics released under the Hays Code rule. So, now it's the late 60s. The Hays Code has been falling away the whole decade with growing political concern coming from more left-wing movements. There is more unrest in America, struggles against Korea and Vietnam, civil rights movements, and countless others. Inside the MPAA, there was also a power struggle for increasing restraint given towards the code, which was going on in the early part of the decade. You can see this restraint come out in the release of films like Psycho and Peeping Tom. Finally, in 1966, the code all but disappeared, except in name, finally allowing a lot more to happen in the movies. That year would see the start of some of the more ambitious semi-independent releases I spoke about, with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, a film that would get essentially the early equivalent of an R rating. The next year, a true low-budget effort and one scandalous in story would release, The Graduate. Suddenly, there was a new trend for the money to follow because The Graduate was hugely successful, not only financially but culturally. It touched on fears of the day, resonated with the younger generation, and the disillusionment they were feeling. And most importantly, it was painfully honest about life. The Graduate sees morally corrupt characters. It doesn't have a traditional happy ending, and its director, Mike Nichols, interestingly the same guy who directed Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, took a new direction with the camera, making it more subjective, more attached to the character, and using a handful of interesting cinematic tricks, which made the film feel fresh. That same year, at the official death of the code, Bonnie and Clyde released, a movie that would change everything. Using the same unique visual metaphor-focused, subjective camera of The Graduate, and loaded with sex and violence. Even looking back today, Bonnie and Clyde is a surprisingly violent film with incredibly realistic squibs, lots of gunplay, no moral redemption. After all, the film follows a set of famous outlaws. Like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde was successful, touched on the sentiments of this younger generation, and told the Hollywood system that a change in taste was here. Other examples from the end of the decade laying the groundwork for New Hollywood include In Cold Blood, Cool Hand Luke, Point Blank, Faces, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead, Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy, and The Wild Bunch. By the time 1970 proper rolled around, the studio developed a new idea. They could give this up-and-coming screenwriters and directors who understood the younger generation near free rein, a relatively low budget, and the final film could easily make well above the invested money, as well as being critically well received. It was a win-win all around, and for the first half of the decade, it worked wonders. Some of the greatest Hollywood outings come from this time: The Godfather 1 and 2, Chinatown, Taxi Driver, and The Exorcist. Then, as success seemed endless, Hollywood made an interesting gamble. What if they gave these directors and writers a larger budget? What could be done? The experiment played out in 1975 and 77 when Steven Spielberg and George Lucas each laid the groundwork for the Hollywood blockbuster. Jaws, the first to release, played with horror and action to create a must-see film where, still staying true to the semi-independent, auteur-driven cinema of the era, focusing on real characters and real problems, presented something that was a little more bombastic than before. Then, following 2 years later, Lucas's ambitious space opera blew even Jaws out of the water with Star Wars, still being the second highest grossing film ever, and Jaws itself being seventh. This is all adjusted for inflation. Just as the independent efforts of the 60s told the studio it was time for a change, this was even more of a direct message. Although, unlike the start, which was the culmination of countless factors, including the breaking of monopolies, the loss of theater control at the studios, which led to them being far less powerful and needed to take chances financially, now they were at the height of their power again. The end of the 70s would see the resolution of this experiment and the answer to the question, if studios just threw money at these creators without changing any of the previous formula, would it still be profitable? The answer, for the most part, unsurprisingly, was no. With films like Alien, Apocalypse Now, Sorcerer, and The Shining all eating up loads of money and only getting a meager profit alongside sometimes critical acclaim. However, the studios were caring less and less about the critical aspect as films like Empire Strikes Back, which despite being artistic in its achievement, were showing how mainstream, less experimental, more narrative, commercial-driven cinema could turn a much larger profit. Combine this with some of the biggest flops ever in the early 80s, One from the Heart, Inchon, Yes Giorgio, and you begin to see the changing current. During all of this, an up-and-coming artist named Michael Cimino was entering the scene, at first very subtly. Cimino began his notable career as a writer. In fact, he wrote or co-wrote 3 beloved films of the period, Silent Runnings, Magnum Force, and The Outlaw Josie Wales. While writing 1974's Thunderbolt and Lightning, he was given the chance to take the director's chair for the first time. Though this was his first directorial effort, it was largely forgotten, even now. And what actually ended up happening was he would have a giant hit with his second directed film, The Deer Hunter. The Deer Hunter, released in 1978, was one of the first films in Hollywood to deal with Vietnam and to really explore the effects war can have on a person. It had a brilliant script, co-written by Cimino, and fantastic directing, which paid attention to every detail. Upon release, it was a critical and commercial success and quickly drew the eye of United Artists, a struggling studio at the time who had been looking for someone new that they could throw loads of money at. This is when they decided to fund Cimino's next project, Heaven's Gate. Very soon, due to Cimino's huge ambition and need to make everything perfect, including his desire to build entire towns, giant systems, and shoot for only 5 minutes a day to get the light just right, kind of reminds you of Days of Heaven, doesn't it? The film was hugely over budget. Not only that, but the final product was a 4-hour-long film which Cimino slapped a sepia-tone filter over to make it nearly unwatchable for everyone, of course. When the film released in 1981, only briefly, it was inevitable that it would fail, but no one expected it to sink all of UA as well. Not to mention ruin Cimino's career and reputation, essentially. If you would like to learn more about the specifics of this and the disaster of a production that this film was, I recommend you go watch New Perspective's 2-part documentary on it. I learned a lot of my knowledge about the set from this work, and the video itself is a great exploration of all the myriad factors that tore Heaven's Gate down. Though it's hard to point a finger at a single movie, the failure of Heaven's Gate, alongside the burgeoning release of blockbusters like Return of the Jedi and Raiders of the Lost Ark, showed that the new Hollywood movement was over. The money was now in the mega commercial blockbuster, a change being felt even to the present day. So, what's the deal with Heaven's Gate? Now, I am a little biased and inaccurate here. I watched, luckily, the Criterion Remaster, which takes away the sepia and fixes the color, and really brings out all the beauty Cimino and his cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond originally shot. I could understand how seeing this in 1981 might have been a real headache, and appreciate all the criticism that choice received from critics and audiences alike. However, pointing to Heaven's Gate for years as one of the worst films ever made will forever be mind-boggling to me. Even taking the sepia into consideration, looking at the overindulgent sequences and bloated runtime, even if you can't appreciate the world Cimino develops, you have to appreciate at least the message the film manages to convey. Because in a lot of ways, this is Leone in America. This is the spaghetti, or I guess more aptly, hamburger western. This film, in its very unfocused 4 hours, is about real events in American history. The Johnson County incident, which struck poor immigrants being extorted and murdered by cattle barons in the Wyoming Stock Organization. And perhaps its most interesting contribution is using this story to talk about the qualities of America and the corruption which is prevalent from its start even to today. See, the film is really about how private organizations with a lot of capital manage to control the government through friends and through financial power, whether that be the mayor, the president, etc., and how this financial power is used to gain more money through the exploitation, or in this case, outright murder of the poor. And in the case of the film, a handful of European immigrants. That's a bold story to tell today, alone in 1980. Even more bold because in the real history, the federal government wasn't originally involved. In fact, it was just the local government of Wyoming and not the president, as the film suggests. Like when I talked about Walker, I can't help but think a big part of Heaven's Gate's downfall owes to its overt political undercurrent. But it's also important to understand that this was a staple of the era. Because of the freedom given to filmmakers and screenwriters, many of the new Hollywood projects were overtly political and at times very anti-establishment in their politics. Even Star Wars, one of the big blockbusters of the time, takes an anti-imperial stance and uses the aesthetics of World War II to comment on American involvement in Vietnam, at least according to George Lucas. No, the real problems of Heaven's Gate, or at least the factor which destroyed it, are the overindulgences it enjoys. See, the film opens with a only tangentially related prologue at Harvard. This does serve to introduce two characters. One of them will be one of our three leads. The second is only a minor supporting character for the rest of the film. Most of this sequence is made up of a speech and a dancing scene. This will become a recurring occurrence, as you'll see. And the sequence lasts for about 30 minutes. It's about 25. Almost half, or 1/4 of the runtime of a normal feature is taken up by this barely related prologue. From this alone, you begin to understand why Heaven's Gate became so controversial. In truth, this prologue does actually do a couple of things. Most importantly is the introduction of James Averill. It shows the world he comes from, and eventually goes back to. It introduces his Eastern wife, at least as far as I can tell from the film's end. It shows his joyful enthusiasm and contrasts the world of the East with the brutality of the West, the lawlessness. Secondly, it establishes a dichotomy between James and Billy. Both come from here, but where James fights back against the establishment, Billy falls right into it, despite having his own reservations and eventually leading to his drunkenness and overall apathy towards everything. It establishes the ability to break out of the status quo, to genuinely hold on to something one believes, and that will be contrasted again later in the movie between James and Nathan Champion. The final piece of this prologue is a piece shared with the rest of the film, world building. Just as Cimino wanted to create Wyoming and the West to perfection, he also wanted to create Harvard during the 19th century. The dress, the light, the buildings, everything is carefully selected as a way to ease the audience into this world, and ultimately, that's kind of the point of this prologue, an easing into the world. After that, and after a brief scene introducing Nathan Champion and the immigrant families, we cut to older James on a train, and the movie can start properly. Now, keep in mind, we're 30 minutes in here, so you begin to understand that this is not a traditional film. As for the train, trains are often transitory spaces. Look at all the Ozu films, or any Western for that fact. In fact, starting a Western with a train is a bit of a tradition, with the best example, of course, being the other great anti-Western, Once Upon a Time in the West. The rest of the film from there, until the last 5 minutes, plays out in Wyoming, going between Casper and Jackson County. Avril has become a sheriff of sorts for the small community, helping them to fight back against the land association and settling feuds. But the landowners are tired of the theft and property, and they want to maximize their profit on their land. They want to essentially get rid of all these immigrants. The main conflict plays out in a web of connection. First between Avril and Champion over the love of Ella, then for their stance with the landowners, then between Avril and the landowners themselves, his former Harvard classmates, and of course even in parts between Avril and the community of immigrants he's trying to help. It's amazing even now to see the faces that pop up in this film. Chris Christopherson, Christopher Walken, John Hurt, Brad Dourif, Jeff Bridges, Joseph Cotton, and even more amazing is the continued indulgence of the film. The middle or so of the movie features a 10-minute or more dance sequence, the second of these, with a fiddler on roller skates, and it's actually quite a bit of fun if you can just sit down and enjoy it. Enjoy the world as Cimino intended. On the surface, this might seem superfluous, but it actually serves two purposes. The first is to create a contrast and important aspect to every piece of this movie, to juxtapose the violence and American horror with the dream of America, living free, having fun, enjoying life as it should be, what these immigrants came to America expecting. The second purpose is a more structural one. See, Heaven's Gate is a deconstructionist film, or at least it can easily be thought of as one. Its purpose is to break away the illusion of the West, as Leone did 2 decades before, and as Eastwood would attempt again in the next decade. However, it also wants to deconstruct and comment on the epic as a whole. It wants to use this principal medium, which has generally been utilized by strong American conservative type pieces like Lawrence of Arabia, Gone with the Wind, Bridge over the River Kwai, and instead of just reappropriating the form to reclaim it, as The Godfather or Apocalypse Now had done, it wants to actively destroy it, to invert it, and reclaim it in that fashion. Heaven's Gate is essentially an anti-epic, taking away all the prestige and fun of enjoying a 4-hour movie with a sweeping scale. It might still have the world, it might have the landscapes and the runtime, but it carefully selects every piece to minimize the epicness, because ultimately this film is about something sadly commonplace: American imperialism, the reveal of the blood and genocide and horror the nation was built on, forever standing as a shadow over the life it promises. It exposes the way inequality and exploitation has always been a piece of the American experience, the American dream, through a true story, which for our own protection we would like to believe is only in the past. Avril goes on in the film to meet with the landowners and has a conversation mostly about the list of names they've drafted, people they're going to kill, and it encapsulates everything up until that point. And he speaks with Billy, his old friend, who recognizes these facts but is trapped by his own place in this system, having brought his Eastern life with him instead of abandoning it, as James did. James meets with Ella, giving her a new cart and introducing us to their long-running romance and this film's love interest. She runs a brothel in town to help pay for land and bills, another example of the hard realities of the time, often overlooked by pre-spaghetti westerns. The landowners recruit mercenaries and eventually the National Guard to essentially slaughter all the immigrants because they have legally branded them as thieves or general miscreants. The rest plays out in an explosion of violence until James has lost everything in this world and the landowners have won. From there, he's forced to return to his old life, from train to boat, floating away back east with his wife and his privileged life. He had an escape because of his status, and that's how the film ends. The good guy doesn't win. There's no grand sweeping music to make us feel that everything will be all right. Instead, that's just how things are, and always have been. And 4 hours, nearly, later, Cimino takes us out on black credits and soft guitar music, leaving us only with the memories. Needless to say, Heaven's Gate is an extremely unique film. It intentionally breaks down the conventions it's meant to inhabit and slowly erodes the myth of America which it is built on. In a fitting way, it's a perfect culmination to the era which birthed it, the rowdy and free and political New Hollywood, which had attempted many similar projects, the aforementioned Godfather and Apocalypse Now being good examples. Should this have been the nail in the coffin of that free, idealized form of Hollywood, though? Well, the over-budget financial box office failure destroyed United Artists and served a pretty clear warning sign to the other companies. The politics of the film were maybe a little too real, even for the overtly political time which it was released. The runtime and unwatchable quality of much of the film certainly led a lot of people to question if these directors, driven by auteur theory, should be given the freedom they had seen. Would we have been better off if Cimino had never opened Heaven's Gate? It's hard to say, but whether this is what leads to the 80s and eventually the modern Hollywood content farm or not, it's an important film in its own right. And it's a beautiful, uncompromising piece of art. Not to mention a brilliantly misunderstood masterpiece. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a lot of fun to trace the lineage of Hollywood, and I do plan to do something similar in the next video, where I'm going to talk about Orson Welles and his carte blanche debut alongside his final produced piece. I hope you'll join me then, and no matter how hard one might try to kill the artist, as Hollywood tried Cimino, you can never kill the art. Thank you.